Hi, good evening. My name is Gavin. I'm 27 years old, and I wanted to make this YouTube video because I wanted to kind of put my candid and honest thoughts out there about my love for 1920s and early 30s jazz and kind of my opinions on the revival jazz scene as of the current day. My love for jazz goes back quite some time. I started out with bebop as kind of hard bop, kind of the 1950s and early 60s style of jazz, most famously associated with Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk and all of those fellas, and it's very good music. And don't get me wrong. And then I also, of course, grew up knowing about music. You kind of get introduced to people like Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller and Artie Shaw, Count Basie, and all of them. And that was really the only jazz I really knew until I really came across, funnily enough, how I got introduced to kind of the jazz of the 1920s was actually through a DVD box set of Felix the Cat cartoons. So a lot of these were coming out in the mid to late 2000s, and my paternal grandparents so happened to own a DVD box set of one of these Felix the Cat cartoons. And I was very into animation history, black and white cartoons, and so I would watch these cartoons all the time, every time I'd visit my grandparents' house. So then from there, I was really attached to the music that they put over a lot of those cartoons. And it wasn't until later, until I was probably maybe 17 or 18 years old, that I found out that a lot of that music wasn't just some stock, 1920s tunes. It actually turned out it was music recorded by Jelly Roll Morton and his Hot Peppers. And these sessions were from kind of later in his career. Not his absolute latest, where he recorded in the 30s and early 40s, but kind of later in his golden years, 1928, when he recorded with Victor in New York City. And those were the first kind of tracks I was really kind of introduced to for hot jazz. And all these years later, I was really interested in the sound and really interested in really remembered this music quite well, and it really stuck out in my mind, just the way the trumpet and the clarinet both had their solos in some of these recordings, and it was just very memorable, and it was very unique, and just in terms of the jazz that I remembered listening to. So I basically revisited it, just wanting to know who the artist was, and it turns out it was Jelly Roll Morton. And of course, as some of you may know, he was one of the most innovative, jazz musicians of the entire, early jazz movement. He was one of the first to really revolutionize jazz in the way of, scoring and composition and notation, while also keeping the looseness and syncopation of jazz in check. And that was something that was very hard then, and it's something that's incredibly hard now when notating jazz. So I really connected with this music, and it really stood out to me, and it was something special that I wanted to dive into. So I ended up getting a 5-disc DVD box set from JSP Records, restored by the late and great John R.T. Davies of Britain, who was extremely famous for restoring 70 RPM shellac records, and even sourcing the metal parts recorded in the studio for a lot of these old 1920s and 1930s sessions. And once I heard that, that kind of audio quality was possible for such an old recording, it really opened my eyes to just kind of the genius and revolutionary nature of this music. And so naturally, from Jelly Roll Morton, I wanted to know so much more about hot jazz. And so I started diving to the whole entire rabbit hole. From all the New Orleans and kind of Chicago style artists, of course, starting with Jelly Roll Morton, and then I discovered Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings, which of course were incredibly groundbreaking. still highly reviewed recordings at this time. I discovered King Oliver's recordings. And then I've discovered about the Harlem jazz scene, and that quickly became some of my absolute favorites, such as Duke Ellington and his Cotton Club era music from around 1926 to around 1931 before he left the Cotton Club. And then I found out about Fletcher Henderson. I found out about Louis Russell. I found out about Don Redman, and I found out about all these other, smaller bands that existed at the time. And then I even learned about bands that were even outside of that whole circle. Lots of territory bands that existed in the Midwest and even in the South. Even Texas had some territory jazz bands that existed that were stationed in Dallas and San Antonio. And then in the Midwest, going back to then, I discovered the great and the highly underrated Benny Moten, who started recording as early as 1923, I believe, is when he first made his recordings, and it was some of the most groundbreaking, hottest, blues-driven jazz, just unique sound I've ever heard. And I was just I couldn't believe how kind of unknown a lot of his music is and underappreciated it is. And overall, I just became obsessed with this sound. Once I really dove into the rabbit hole that was, early hot jazz and early swing. I usually like to call it proto swing, since it didn't really have that smooth, rhythm to it yet. But once I got enveloped in this kind of jazz, I did not want to listen to any other jazz, and just kind of ruined it for me. And so I have a very particular taste now. So in the case for swing music, I don't like how smooth it is, especially the mid 30s and later recordings of smooth jazz, where just not smooth jazz, but swing music, in which the sound was smoothed out. A lot of the technicality and the prowess and the kind of the allowance of solos to be done by the musicians just kind of went out the wayside, and it just started becoming a very it's hard to put the words together, but it became a very just kind of bland, dare I say, sound. It just became too safe, and of course, I wasn't the only one that believed that. Even people at the time thought, jazz was becoming too commercialized, especially going into the into the 1940s and the World War II era. And that's where you get the bebop era, when you had players like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker come out with the bebop era, where they brought a return back to more experimentation and more jazz meant to progress the genre further in terms of experimentation and technicality. And I actually really like early bebop music, kind of from around the early 40s to the early 50s. But kind of after that, jazz has kind of drops off in interest for me, just because I just think after that it became too much of a kind of an academic, brainiac, kind of genre, where it's more of a less of a visceral, danceable enjoyment, and more of a music that makes you think, that you kind of have to think about and sit down to, rather than something that really gets you up. And I know that really varies depending on the person. I know not everybody has that same opinion as I, but yeah, as for me, both swing music and later bop styles like hard bop and other spin-off jazz genres like that just don't really speak to me the same way as hot jazz and kind of that early swing or proto swing really speaks for me, because in my opinion, I really think that hot jazz and that early big band sound was just kind of a culmination of everything I want in jazz. It's very danceable, but it is complex both harmonically. There's complex arrangements and very daring solo, instrument playing, and experimentation to it. That it's kind of an all of the above kind of genre for where you can dance to it, but you can also really enjoy it as a listener as well. And one thing that's kind of worth mentioning for my preference in jazz, I know a lot of people who are into the hot jazz, era. There's a lot of reverence for a lot of the white orchestras and white musicians that existed at the time. Most notably, Bix and Red Nichols and Benny Goodman and the original Dixieland Jazz Band and the New Orleans Rhythm Kings and probably a bunch of other bands and ensembles that I'm probably forgetting about. And that's one thing I've kind of seen a lot of in the current kind of revival jazz scenes, is that there's a lot of reverence for these fellas, but there really isn't as much reverence for the black artists. And I know that's not always the case. Usually people like to bring up Louis Armstrong and King Oliver, which they should. They really helped break the ground for hot jazz in the early to mid 1920s, and of course before that, I mean, Louis Armstrong became one of the most famous jazz musicians of all time, and he was a successful artist all the way into the late 60s. Of course, his hit like "It's a Wonderful World" or "La Vie en Rose" and stuff like that. But in any case, to get back to the point, I think it's highly unfortunate that a lot of the black artists are just kind of tossed to the wayside. And when you really think about it, just the way the recording industry was back then, if you really dive into the history of the way everything worked back then, I mean, black artists, I mean, not only in the United States where did they have to be subjugated to racist and discriminatory laws just domestically whenever it came to public areas, housing, jobs, things of that sort. But the discrimination and racism even, kind of transferred over into the record industry. There was something called race records that existed. So they separated commercial releases based off of the race of the musicians that performed the music. And with a lot of the jazz performed by black artists and orchestras and singers back then, they would be released on race subsidiary labels, or not subsidiary. They would just be released in something called the race record category, and they would really only cater to people to colored communities. And so in a lot of the cases, you just kind of had to be either a part of those communities or just somehow in the know of those particular records in order to really recognize them. So just kind of from the beginning, those records were just kind of made to be a niche and have a narrow exit point for consumption of public listening. And just another unfortunate thing at that time, a lot of people, when jazz first became a thing and it was the new and rebellious genre that it was, there was a lot of backlash for it, not just for the musicality of it alone, for the volume and the kind of the daringness of it alone, but it also, the music had a lot of association with Black and African American culture, and stiff and people really did not like that fact, unfortunately. And that's not to say that the music still didn't spread around and it still didn't become a global phenomenon, despite all of those who had discriminatory racist outlooks on the music. But it's definitely worth mentioning as to why I think the kind of the reach of those artists just couldn't have been as big as they could have been, which is a massive shame because personally, I pretty much only listen to hot jazz and big band music by black orchestras. And it really doesn't have to do just alone with the fact that they were discriminated against. Like it's not, it doesn't have to do anything with just, you know, it doesn't really have to do anything directly with, for me personally, trying to make me feel more righteous or anything like that by listening to it. I just legitimately believe that, they just put a lot more ingenuity and expressive freedom and, energy and pep and grit into those recordings. It's just so visceral and just feels so true and just either joyous or sorrowful, that it's just kind of hard to ignore, and it's hard for me to kind of deny how powerful that sound is to me. And that's something that a lot of that jazz has. It's drenched in blues. Blues is all about the joys and sorrows of life, and that you can just hear it in every note of that music. And I suppose in that sense, the music does make you think about the amazement of everything those black musicians went through. Whether it was having to go to, venues, ballrooms, speakeasies, whatever, and having to go through the back door of the club rather than the front where white people were only permitted. And also just thinking about all the sacrifices they made in terms of transportation by, countless hours of travel by bus, by train, by ocean liner for those who toured overseas. It took a toll on a lot of these people, and there's no telling, the stories that a lot of these jazz musicians had, traveling throughout the United States and the world, and just kind of how different things were back then in terms of the way that they were treated. But that's just another thing about the music. Just that black jazz for me just carries just such a feeling of defiance and joy in the face of unimaginable odds, and that's so special to me. I can hear it in every single note that they play, even going on over 100 years later on those recordings. And I'm not trying to diss white musicians. I know most of them actually really did respect black artists. I know Bix absolutely did. For instance, Bix was really big friends with one of Duke Ellington's most famous players, Bubba Miley, who was one of the most innovative trumpeters in terms of using plunger mutes and things of that sort in jazz. And probably countless other examples I'm probably forgetting, or some people could probably remind me in the comments. But in any case, though, the artistry of black musicians speaks to me on a visceral level, and it's just something I just cannot deny. I love it. It means the world to me, and not only just like the instrumental jazz, but also the blues queens. African American women like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and Ethel Waters, Sophia Tucker, and so many others that sang at the time and just kind of broke boundaries, and sung about anything they really wanted, and whether it be infidelity, women empowerment, same-sex innuendos, even, especially from Ma Rainey. Really, forward-thinking and, raw and honest lyrics for a decade that a lot of people associate with Gatsby, Kish, and flapper parties and gangster cliches and stuff like that. And it really brings a lot of humanity back to that decade whenever you really listen to those lyrics and you really listen to the real music of that time. That the music, in my full opinion, absolutely does not deserve to be caricaturized the way it has been for all these decades. The 1920s and the early 30s were a very nuanced time. People more or less were just like us, living in different cultural norms, and we're just trying to get through the days with the technology and the norms that they had. And you can just hear that in the music, of those jazz musicians and singers. And so that kind of brings me to my next point. I don't want to get too off topic here, but I've made a personal effort to kind of go out of my way and really see if I can try to find some bands nowadays that really speak to me in terms of this, early hot jazz and, early big band music. Because, I don't just want to sit, just listening to these records all the time. Because that's one big thing. Like when you listen to just hours and hours of this music and just knowing just the way it was recorded, whether it be the late teens or early 20s, acoustically recorded recordings, or the mid to late 20s and beyond, electrically recorded recordings once they actually introduced, microphones instead of the acoustic recording horns that increase fidelity. Even then, a lot of that, you're still listening to a lot of music that's recorded on the shellac records. And they're monophonic. A lot of times they have surface noise, and a lot of times I really think they, deeply colored and kind of, put a lot of this music in a very unfair haze and nostalgic lens that kind of traps the music. For me personally, I usually can, listen through that and hear the ingenuity and the energy and the just the artistry of when I'm hearing through that surface noise. But also at the same time, it leaves a lot to be desired. And I kind of started asking myself, what did this music sound like if I had my own ears and I were in that recording studio or in front of a concert stage or just a venue, hearing this jazz in person. And if you hear about a lot of these sessions, a lot of these hotter jazz bands, ones that play more intensely, by a number of records, had to tone the music down in the recording sessions just because they were so loud and so visceral that the engineers had to tell them to tone it down. So, and a lot of these records are super hot to begin with, so there's no telling how intense they probably would have been in person. So in any ways, I've made a pretty conceited effort to go out into my local community, and my local city, and scourge out for local jazz scenes, that try to specialize in traditional jazz, and kind of hot jazz configurations. And I've just kind of come up with kind of the same opinions just over time. And I'm not going after anybody on a personal level. Like there is so much talent out there, and so many people in the jazz community are just super friendly people, very intelligent people, obviously have a lot of years and knowledge underneath their belts. So I'm not going after them at all. I have complete and total respect for all of them. But I still have my honest opinions about the way that, early jazz is kind of, introduced to people, and the way a lot of these bands play. And so those bands out there that are a little more historically conscious, a lot of times those bands do go out of the way to have mostly period accurate, instrument configuration. You have the trumpet or the cornet, and then you have the trombone, and then you have the clarinet. Some bands have the saxophone. There'll be some might have an upright piano. Some might go for a digital piano, which is, you can make that work. And some even have a banjoist, which is really cool too. Since a lot of early jazz, from basically its inception up until around the early to mid 1930s, when it started being replaced by the guitar, it was a very commonplace instrument for jazz configurations. And I personally love the way the banjo sounds, mixed in with jazz percussion and jazz style. But in a lot of these cases, I don't know what it is, but whenever it comes to the percussion of a lot of modern bands, It's not even the fact that they're using like a modern drum kit, because if you're familiar with early jazz, the percussion within these jazz ensembles used what they was called trap kit. It's very similar to a modern drum kit, but it's a lot smaller. There's more instrumentation that's not really found now, like you'll have the drums mixed with wood blocks and chimes and other kind of more novelty instrumentation. And in a lot of those cases in early jazz music, it wasn't like a swing rhythm. They weren't writing on the hi hat. It wasn't like a kind of 1930s and 1940s sound. The trap kit, a lot of those jazz musicians really, they played it in a way where they really wrote on the cymbal a lot, and they used choke cymbals a lot. So whenever a band was playing, they would basically just kind of dance on the tune. So it would go, or if it was like like a driving rhythm, and it'd be like something like that, rather than the kind of smoothed out sound from the swing era. But going back to my point, a lot of these modern jazz bands do not go out of the way to have the drummer play in a period accurate way. And I know that might come as kind of nitpicky and a little peculiar, maybe a little unfair in some places where I get it. And, you're not just going to find people who know how to play in that style all the time, really at all. It's not. I don't believe it's really anything that's taught in university or academia. But at the same time, for me, it leaves such a kind of a bad taste in my mouth. While the whole band is, trying to go for the 20s, 30s sound, and then you have the drummer who's just playing kind of swing style, drumming, or something else that sounds modern, and it just does not sound right, and it just kills the sound, and it's just not really true to how the music really sounded. And not just that, it's not even just about the period accuracy. It's also, I personally feel like the way that percussionists approached the music back then, I feel like just had more power. It was more visceral. Not in terms of like pure skill of like a swing or bebop drummer, where they could play at 1,000,000 miles an hour and go across all the different drums at incredible speeds. But it was kind of more in the sense of like a stripped down but still very intense, very infectious sound. Because hearing that choke cymbal as the rhythm goes along, oh my God, it just makes me feel so excited. It makes me, it's such a very raw sound, because I mean it's like it feels impactful, and it gives it that stomping syncopated rhythm that just kind of gives that early hot jazz its soul. So when it doesn't really have that, it's just very unfortunate. And then another thing about a lot of early jazz bands that really gets to me, which this one is definitely more of a nitpick for sure, but a lot of revival jazz bands really don't look or really care about period accurate wardrobes for their musicians, where of course the men would probably wear like a dress shirt and tie, or they would wear a full-on jacket, and a lot of the really and a lot of bands, actually, even those who were a little lesser known, and even some territory bands who weren't as famous as kind of the big orchestras, they still came into a lot of venues, ballrooms, and even speakeasies. I mean, any venues at all, and they dressed in their sharpest. They wore tuxedos and bow ties and dress shoes and stuff like that. And when you really think about the African American experience back then. It really comes into focus into where dressing like that wasn't just to just to be dressed to the nines, just for the sake of it, just to look sharp. When you really look into it, the reason why they dressed so nicely back then wasn't just for that. It was because they were looking to dress in a way that restored a sense of dignity and humanity and sophistication to themselves. When they were denied that at a water fountain, denied that at a bathroom, denied that at a bank, a job, it was the way of kind of reclaiming that dignity in the way in which they dressed. And I think that would be something so special if that kind of mentality was kind of tapped in for a lot of modern jazz bands. And I totally get it. There's a lot of people out there that do not like suits. I totally get it. A lot of modern suits nowadays are very constricting. The fashion industry for classic menswear is still in a very slim fit, a slim fit mold for designs nowadays. And a lot of the suits nowadays are just made with really cheap material, polyester and poly blends and synthetic fibers, and that just is. And that plus the slim fit of the jackets and the trousers just really makes things constricting and uncomfortable. And it evokes things like bad business meetings and weddings and other things that just feel really stuffy to people. And I totally get that. But when you actually look at the kind of suits and classic menswear that existed back then, suits were a lot more roomier back then. They were cut in a way that was more generous and more open to your torso and your legs. A lot more room for movement, and then also the fabric of the suits that you're wearing matters. Whereas today, where you get a lot of polyester blends, which really are terrible at trapping your body heat and trapping outside heat. When you have suits that are made out of natural fibers like cotton and linen especially, cotton and linen are very good fibers at a heat regulation of both your body temperature and outside temperature, and it can really help keep you cool. And that plus a more relaxed fit in the jacket and trousers can really make all the difference in the world of the comfort that you have. And you can have all this structure, a dress shirt, a tie, a jacket, but if it's made out of the right materials and it's cut and tailored and it's made in that, made for somebody in that more loose vintage way, it's far more comfortable than what you can find now off the rack at a lot of places. And you can find a lot of these garments for super cheap, like on eBay and resale places, where a lot of people are getting rid of this old roomy classic fit clothing for like bargain prices. They're just kind of getting rid of it because it's just not considered it's not considered the latest fashion, and so there's a lot of degradation of the pricing of a lot of these garments. So it's definitely worth looking into. I know not everybody is going to get into that. People just don't like suits, and I totally get that. But I feel like if more revival jazz, groups wore the kind of historically accurate clothing, it would kind of build a closer connection to what a lot of those men went through. And I could even point to women too, like women in dress and things like that. I think would also really enhance that as well. But being a man, kind of menswear is kind of what I know most of. But in any case, though, to get off the topic of fashion, I think the biggest kind of thing I'm just very disappointed in that I've kind of noticed for a lot of modern jazz bands, it's just the prevalence of charts and sheet music while on stage. And I get it. I get that there's the fear of forgetting, the notes. I understand that a lot of, compositions and standards can be really difficult to perform. And of course, I really don't have much excuse myself because I can't play an instrument to save my life. My only instrument is my singing voice and my two ears. So more or less, I'm just a listener. So I cannot claim to say that I could play a brass or reed instrument or a string instrument or the piano better than anybody else. I'd probably make it sound like a 5-year-old playing on a recorder. So, but in any case, though, I totally get why people do it. And I think it's also just something that it makes most sense to me why it's so ingrained, because jazz is just for decades now has become something that's taught in institutions, something that's associated with academia, something that's associated with music theory uh, and just more educational and kind of museum like you know like just a very listener and study focused kind of genre. And I personally think that's been such a detriment to the genre, because hot jazz and early big band swing, early big band music, especially, a lot of it could not be any more opposite from that. So, but even though yes, there did obviously exist, sheet music and notation for jazz bands back then, but that was only used sparingly, and only really used whenever bands were in rehearsal. But once a lot of those bands were on stage on the venue, those charts went away. They just remembered their head arrangements, and they basically, improvised and soloed all around that, just off the top of their heads. And a lot of things, and a big thing about those early jazz musicians is that a lot of them learned music by ear, just by ear training, just memorization, just off the top of their head. Some musicians might have grown up in musically inclined families. A lot of them grew up in families that maybe their father used to play in a marching band, or their mother would play piano, and they would learn off of their parents. Some did go to conservatories, but it was quite rare, especially for African American musicians who were often heavily struggled trying to find any sort of formal institution that would accept them. So a lot of them just by necessity had to rely on ear training, and just kind of knowing the music and just kind of ingraining it within themselves rather than trying to learn the theory behind it. And so I think that's something that's incredibly missing now, because honestly, even though I'm not a musician myself, I can only imagine that when you're looking at a piece of sheet music on stage, you're paying attention to that, and you're kind of trading off some of your attention from the intensity and the soul of the music for the written note. And I hear that tension all the time. And also on another level, that chart and the sheet music, when you're on stage, that's also affecting how the audience is percepting you as well. When people think of sheet music, when people think of notation, they think of classical music. They think of music that they need to sit down and listen to politely, to politely clap for, to politely, applaud, and treat with so much reverence that you can't even, that it's discouraged to really get into it. So there's a massive disconnect there. And it's just a barrier, not just for yourself, but it's a barrier between the connection of your audience. When you're looking at sheet music, the sense of community and, transactional, for lack of better words, nature between artist and in audience is just gone. It's severed. And you feel it. Even if people don't consciously really recognize it or really put it into words, they're subconsciously feeling that tension there. And a lot of that sheet music, Sometimes the way a lot of this music is transcribed just really isn't accurate at all to the actual recordings that you hear. Because in these recordings, yes, you have the general melodies, and then you have the um, kind of the more what's the word? The recurring, melody that happens throughout the song. But through that, you have players who are bending the notes, who are, you know, smearing the notes, adding blues notes. Just they sound like they're just playing off the top of their head and playing from their heart and soul, rather than just letting whatever prearrangement they had in their mind just fully you know dictate how they play. Um, because a lot of these players they more rode on the beat, and they rode on the rhythm of the music rather than playing on the beat, like a lot of revival bands just seem to fall into trap too. Um, and all of this is to say that it just kind of adds up into the way historians have kind of marked jazz now, for decades now, that jazz is considered America's classical music. But I think that's incredibly unfortunate. Um, Jazz used to be America's rock music, in my opinion. Because when you actually look at the stories of a lot of these jazz performances back then, um, the music would be so visceral, so loud, so soulful, so gritty and intense, that people would go wild. Like, for instance, one parallel I love to always talk about is that the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, New York, was known as one of the most prestigious, one of the most high energy clubs in the entire world for jazz. And so I would like to put in a picture of, say you were in Harlem, New York in 1931, and you wanted to go check out Chick Webb and his orchestra, who were the local jazz orchestra for the Savoy at the time. And Chick Webb is known as one of the best jazz drummers there ever was, and him and his band played absolutely hot, scorching jazz that rivaled even some of the best orchestras like Duke Ellington's and Fletcher Henderson's, arguably at the time. So if you were to go in there, I mean, just think about it. You have a 14 plus member band screaming at you, all firing at all cylinders. There's not a single person that's just kind of being lazy or not lazy, rather just kind of phoning it in and just kind of trying to get through the gig and get through another night. No, everybody is playing like their life depends on it. From the brass, from the reeds, to the piano, to the percussion, even the banjo or the sousaphone or tuba or double bass player are firing at all cylinders. And imagine being in front of that 14-piece band while you have hundreds of people around you just dancing and screaming and going crazy, laughing, cheering, yelling out, yeah, like a rock concert. That's what the energy was. And you just don't really have that anymore. And I've even been to some swing dances, and they, play actual big band music. But in a lot of the cases, they're playing a lot of pre-recorded music, which is fine. You can't always get a live band all the time, but there's just this pervading sense of just kind of a quaintness, kind of a tongue-in-cheek energy to it, that I think is very unfortunate. I feel like a lot of people aren't really treating it as something that's kind of in time now. They're treating it as kind of this quaint thing from back in the day, that, they're just kind of, phoning in just for the fun or the irony of it. And that's such a shame, because a lot of hot jazz and, early big band music, obviously did have, humor and satire and playfulness. But it undeniably also had a lot of humility, not always humility. Honestly, there was a lot of bragging and a lot of boasting in a lot of jazz music, but it was rather just very earnest and very sincere at the same time. And you can just kind of hear that in the notes. They weren't playing to be quaint. They were playing to be loud, playing to be groundbreaking and visceral, and really push that energy out there, and have their Black American culture out loud for all to hear, whether it was over record or in a live venue. Uh, and that's something so special to me. And anytime I listen to those recordings, they've gotten me through a lot of really hard times mentally, whether it be the slower bluesy jazz numbers sung by the blues queens, or even the instrumental, joyous, rowdy, jazz music has gotten me through a lot of rough patches in my life. The music means so much to me, and just seeing how it's kind of in a state now, and it's kind of been that way for decades now. There's been countless different revival efforts for this kind of jazz. The 1950s had the Dixieland revival movement, and that was met with a lot of criticism, because you got to think, in the 1950s, a lot of those hot jazz artists were still living at the time, and a lot of it thought it was very watered down and very quaint and very overly nostalgic, and just kind of a shell of what their music was. And I know there's been really good efforts since then. Keith Nichols, who was from Britain, made a really massive effort to kind of save a lot of the jazz and transcribe a lot of it, and he broke his back over it, working for decades and decades on trying to preserve this music. And hats off to him. He deserves all the respect that he has gotten, and he unfortunately passed away in 2022 or 2023. So he was active for a very long time, and he was a big part of the revival jazz community. And I also know the existence of Whitley Bay, the Whitley Bay Jazz Festival in Britain, also, which I, in my opinion, comes the closest to trying to revive that sound. And there's insanely talented people in those scenes, insanely talented. All respect to them. But even these bands that try to get it right, a lot of them are still just playing the music too straight. They're being too safe with it. They're playing with charts on stage. And you can just imagine that, just the charts, just people facing down with their trumpets or whichever instruments they have. It disconnects you. And I want jazz artists to kind of tap into the Black tradition of jazz music. And I know that's not always easy, because a lot of the revival jazz scene, if you really notice, a lot of it is very, white dominated field. And so a lot of people just aren't really familiar, or just really grew up knowing a lot of the, more African American traditions of music, because early jazz had so much influence from Black church, Black gospel, spiritual hymns, chants, field hollers. And you can just hear a lot of that in the music, and it just makes it so special, makes it so soulful. And you just hear it in every ounce in a lot of those, in just almost every single one of those recordings from those Black artists from the time. And you don't really hear much of that. It's just, it feels watered down. It feels too safe, too clean. Even when bands try to play loud with more volume, it still feels like there's a hindrance there. And I think it's because in a lot of academic and college circles where early jazz is taught, it's very much in a way where there's an emphasis on getting a clean sound out of your trumpet, or playing with a brightness and a clarity, whereas the Black orchestras smeared and bent and dragged the notes along, and more or less kind of danced across the rhythm, rather than just playing on beat all the time. Um, and and that just introduced a lot of humanity and, uh, and just inventiveness and soul, um, to the music. And I know that's not really an objective thing. It's kind of more of an ideal or an idea rather than something that's fully, um, thing. But in any case, that's what I really wish for in jazz today. And haven't come across any bands today that really meet that mark for me, where they meet the period accurate instrumentation, period accurate clothing, but also invoke that black tradition of the way the music was played. It seems like everybody wants to play like Bix or Red Nichols or the Rhythm Kings, rather than, you know, Louis Armstrong or King Oliver, or even the Harlem bands like early Duke Ellington, which is my absolute favorite. I absolutely am in love with Duke's early material, or Fletcher Henderson, or any of the other, jazz greats that were out there, Jabbo Smith, and so many other artists that I can't, that would just be too long for me to name them all, in this video. As I've already been speaking for 50 minutes already, so I don't need to add, more to that. So, but if there's anybody out there that feels the same way as I do whenever it comes to, 1920s and early 30s jazz, please do comment down below. I want to hear from you, because in a lot of cases I feel like I'm just kind of alone in these opinions. I've always been kind of insecure about my opinions, and I've always felt like I've kind of been, a black sheep in the herd, about the way I feel towards this music. And I've always been, concerned about offending people, concerned about, rubbing against and creating tension that I absolutely don't like, that I absolutely don't want, because I hate arguing with people. I hate confrontation. And I don't intend to step on anybody's toes or disrespect anybody. That's not my intention. And I know there's so much talent out there, so much talent, and so many very kind and welcoming people out there in the community. But I still have these opinions, and I'm still feeling this way despite that. And I'm kind of hoping there's anybody, I'm kind of shouting out into the void, hoping there's anybody that feels the same way as I do too. Who would like to see this sound finally, revitalized. Yeah, please feel free to comment down below to share your opinions or just your thoughts, if you've watched this video this long. And I just want to say again that, hot jazz, just all that music just means absolutely so much to me. And I listen to it almost every single day. Hours on end. Like, I am obsessed with this music. I treat it like my rock music. And if it could ever come to a point where jazz can become America's rock music, where a trumpet solo or a banjo or a trap kit can make somebody shout out viscerally, curse even, like a rock concert, with the intensity that the music had, then that would be like a mission accomplished for me. And I hope it would be for other people out there as well, who want jazz to be more than just a museum piece, something to please a professor or please, music critics. I want it to be something that people can really feel, and feel a sense of joy and community around, rather than something that just is studied, and seen as something quaint and old school. Because for me, this music and its impact travels all these almost 90 to 100 plus years later, and just hits me right in the soul. And I hope it does for other people out there as well who feel something similar to me. So yes, like I said, please feel free to comment below, and I'd love to hear from you. But yes, my name is Gavin, like I said. And I thank you very much for watching this video. And if you've made it this far into the video, I wish you a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening, no matter who you are, where you're from. And whatever you're going through with life, I hope you know, as the Star Trek saying goes, live long and prosper, but in a sincere and genuine way. I believe in the decency of almost all people. And I know a lot of people are just trying to get by in life. And so yes, I wish the absolute best for all of you out there. And thank you so much for watching my video. I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you.